now I would like to present our special guest, Hussein Askary, who is the Middle East Director for the Schiller Institute and the Middle East correspondent for our magazine Executive Intelligence Review, who has been working together with the leader of our campaign, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, and our whole international campaign since 1995, and is also the chairman of our organization, the European Labor Party in Sweden, and has also been writing many articles which have been published throughout the Arabic world, and also has a homepage where Arabic language material is circulated internationally. So we thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm also Iraqi Swedish. So this is my native country is Iraq. I left Iraq in '91 after the Kuwait War and the disasters there. Today is January 21st. In the United States, it's called the Martin Luther King Memorial Day. And Dr. Martin Luther King is one of the greatest, not only African Americans, but one of the greatest human beings of the 20th century, and also political leaders whose life and work should really inspire every one of us to live up to the ideals which he was representing. So in these days we need that kind of inspiration, actually, because all around the world we have economic collapse, we have wars, civil wars, we have wars of aggression, and we have threats of wars, like the threats being posed against Iran. We have a tragedy in Syria, and so on and so forth. We saw last week we had this kidnapping in Algeria. It became world news, where foreigners and Algerians were kidnapped at an oil and gas production site in southern Algeria, which ended up in a somehow bloody solution. But there's what is common in all these developments around the world is that the underlying factor is not political and religious differences, which is the underlying factor for this. The underlying factor is that we have had a political and economic system dominated by what we call the British Empire or the transatlantic empire. It's a political and economic system which is collapsing now. It's economically bankrupt, it's politically bankrupt. It has its seat in the city of London and Wall Street and Washington, unfortunately. And generally in the history of mankind, the collapse of major empires always leads to a dark age. Because when these empires, they don't build anything great for society. What they do is they can only live by looting other nations, building a military capability, but then they suck the blood of nations around them far away, but then when there's no more blood to suck and resources to steal from them, they come closer and closer to home, and eventually they destroy their own nations. This happened with the Greek Empire, it happened with the Roman Empire, and we had almost a dark age after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We had the Black Death at the collapse of the Venetian Empire in the 14th century, which dominated politics, wars, the Crusades, and the economic and banking system in Europe in the 14th century. And when that system collapsed, it had already destroyed the infrastructure and the livelihood of people even in Europe. And then the Black Death could easily, which came with the Mongol invasion earlier from the east, could easily get a foothold into Europe and destroy almost Europe. Collapsed totally. And this is generally what follows. So it does not have necessarily to be the case that if this transatlantic system today collapses, and with it we have Europe, which is in the middle of this crisis, it's not necessarily that we have to live another dark age. What we can do is we can learn from history and implement the lessons we have learned already, and we are also grateful that in the last 200-300 years, we have had positive developments where the idea of the sovereign nation state has been established. We have relatively, we can say, constitutional nation states. We have people who have, after the American Revolution, for example, we have a constitution in the United States. If implemented, then we can solve these problems. We don't have to get into a dark age or through a world war or so. So the solution, we are right now at the LaRouche movement in the United States specifically, but even here in Europe, as you may have noticed from the Schiller Institute campaigns, we are in the very big fight inside the United States around the new Congress to push the idea of what we call the 3 steps. Lyndon LaRouche, the leader of our international organization and the American leader of our organization, he presented a 3-step solution, which starts with what we call the bank separation. Because if we don't solve the financial and banking crisis, we will not be able to stabilize the political situation to solve these other problems we have. So the 3 steps start with, and we're going to go maybe more in detail into that after I present my... Okay.
Just one second, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I forgot to... Er nogen, som ikke forstår engelsk, som vil have oversættelse? Ja. Jeg forstår ikke. Okay.
Need translation?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. All right, so the first step is what we call the re-implementation of the Glass-Steagall bank separation law. It's a bank regulation law which was established in 1933 under the President Franklin Roosevelt, which said that financial institutions that deal with financial speculation, which is the reason for the current crisis too, should not be mixed with the banks. Banks should be banks. We put in money, and they loan money to individuals and companies, and also channel government funds into real economic activity. So these two should not be mixed. Since 1999, we have the Glass-Steagall was repealed, and we have a system where everything is mixed, where we have the deposit banking, the commercial banking, and the investment banking. They are all put in one pot, and these institutions have become so big that when they go bankrupt, they threaten whole nations. So nations, the United States, Britain, Ireland, Greece, all these nations, they have to come with a package to help those banks because they say these are too big to fail, they call them. So because if these banks and financial institutions collapse, the whole society collapses. That's what they say. And therefore governments have to pump in money to these financial institutions, as also the Federal Reserve in the United States have done, trillions of dollars. The European Central Bank is printing money basically electronically, it's not even on paper, and giving to banks and financial institutions to keep this bubble going. So the first step is you separate those two, because then you separate what we call the cancer, which is the financial speculative system, from the healthy part of the banking system, which we need as a modern society. But that in itself is not enough. The next step is to create, in the United States cases, they build what we call a national bank or a government-regulated bank, which can issue credit, sovereign credit, because people say money is part of, people believe a lot in money. But according to the US Constitution, the only legitimate money is that which is issued by the United States government and Treasury, but also should be directed towards productive investments. That's the only type of legitimate money. Today, banks and financial institutions, they can create their own money by having a little deposit, but then they can create financial and monetary instruments, which then they can use to manipulate the whole economy. So that will not be allowed anymore. Government will issue credit through a national bank or government institutions, and that money will be channeled even through private banks, but that money should be earmarked for investments, productive investments in society, infrastructure, industry, housing, and so on and so forth. Productive activities to get the society into work, production, and better welfare. And then the third step is to launch a global campaign, but based also on national decisions, where nations can start building large-scale infrastructure projects, industrial projects, science projects, and these will eventually, or immediately, they will start employing millions of people with productive labor. We're going to give some examples of these. So there's a big fight in the United States right now. We have a big fight in Europe. But in the United States, in Congress, before the election, there was a number of Congress people, one who initiated this idea to reinstate the Glass-Steagall laws, called Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat. She introduced a proposal for reinstating that law, and up to 80 congressmen and women, they signed that. So it could become for discussion and voting in the Congress, because the Congress have to take a decision on these things. After the elections, this has to be reintroduced. So she reintroduced it to the Congress, and now there's other congressmen are going back and signing the same legislation to introduce to the new Congress. And our members of our movement, they have been actively working in Washington, meeting with the new congressmen, the so-called freshmen. The old ones who are already there, they are already informed about this, but they're being kicked by our political activists to have the courage to support this law. And then there are the so-called freshmen, new elected Congress members are being, our members, they go there, they talk to them, they talk to their assistants and try to get them to support this law. So there is a very big fight inside Washington, actually, and even it's coming out. It's not only us talking about this. This is coming out in the media. It's coming up again in the middle of, by people working in the bank sector, people in official American institutions, in the Federal Reserve, and the financial inspection institutions. So this is becoming a known subject for discussion politically in the United States for how to solve the crisis. We have the same thing in Europe, mostly in Britain, ironically, which is the center of this financial. But there are people in Britain who believe that to save their empire, they need to get rid of the financial cancer and keep what they can keep of their banking and economic empire. So this is a very big discussion in Britain to have this law. It doesn't matter for us as long as they do the right thing. Britain is not, it's not like an evil nation or anything. The United Kingdom or England, this is also a nation. It's a sovereign nation. They should be supported if they want to do the right policy. So this is becoming a very big issue. The problem is that we have had the past few years in the United States that this law is not being taken seriously by the administration, is that we have a president who's against that. You can have the first. President Barack Obama is being, he has the inauguration festival now, where he will swear, he will give his speech, inaugural speech for the second time in Washington. I think it's being broadcast right now. But what we have seen of President Obama is not only that he blocked all the solutions for a reasonable outcome for the financial economic crisis, especially Glass-Steagall, he sabotaged, and the people behind him in Wall Street, they sabotaged everything we and other people in the United States have done to get that economic solution in place. But what he's being known for now, and we have been using this poster, unfortunately you have to do two persons just to give people an image, is Dr. Martin Luther King is known for his speech, I have a dream. But what President Obama has, he has a drone. And you know what drones are. These are unmanned airplanes that travel thousands of kilometers and bomb, they say, terrorists. But we have seen the outcome of these. We have thousands of women and children being killed in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Yemen. And this is continuing. And these decisions to bomb the so-called suspects are taken personally by President Obama on Tuesdays. And it's like a special, they sit in a room and he picks the targets and they give them very phony names. But President Obama is known because he promised to end the wars, but what he's creating is creating new types of wars. Now what Obama is going to face now, the last time he became president, people said, well, he's going to have a honeymoon for a few months, so we see what he does. Now he got 4 years and he did not do what he told people or promised people to do, either on the economic policy or on the war policy, because he has continued the same policies of the Bush administration. But what he's going to have now is no honeymoon. There's a massive mobilization to impeach the president, according to the Constitution, we don't like regime change, especially by foreign powers. But what our people in the United States are doing is that they say, according to the Constitution, and there are people in Congress like Walter Jones, John Kucinich, these people have introduced legislation in Congress because they say President Obama has broken the US Constitution and also international law by, for example, launching the war against Libya. Because in the United States, it's the Congress which takes the decision to go to war or not. But Obama, he took the decision to bomb Libya and support what we now know to be terrorist groups inside Libya to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. That he did that without the consent of the Congress, and he went against the US Constitution and international law. Obama says this was not a war. It was a picnic or something. So he did not need to do that. But what we are doing in the United States, and this is being widely circulated, we call it a fact sheet. They have facts about how it's called, is the Obama administration allied with Al-Qaeda in Libya and Syria? And it has all the facts which we have been putting together to show that President Obama actually, especially since the war in Libya, he has allied himself with the same international terrorist groups which he claims is fighting in Afghanistan, but this time they are our allies to overthrow Gaddafi, and then they were moved actually physically from Libya with weapons with the help of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, other US, British allies, into Syria, to Turkey, and from Turkey they go into Syria, or from Lebanon into Syria, to launch what we have now is a mass slaughter inside Syria, a massive tragedy, which is supported, unfortunately, by the government of the United States and the European governments. And they say this is for democracy and freedom, which is not the case. We have all the evidence that the ones who are launching the war against the Syrian army and against the people, against the police, are mostly these terrorist groups. They have the Ansar al-Sharia, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all these things. Even in the United States, they have called them terrorists. The U.S. State Department have assigned this Jabhat al-Nusra, which is very active in Syria. They do most of the suicide bombing in Syria. Now, officially, in the United States, they are terrorists. But it doesn't matter because the United States and Britain's friends, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, support them. They don't consider them terrorists. So they get weapons, and Obama administration had actually, according to documents, have asked the Qatari government not to send American-marked weapons to Syria. So it's not shown physically that the arms from the United States, so they had to choose other types of weapons. So they take weapons from Libya, which are Russian-produced weapons, into the war in Syria. But the policy is the same, the policy originates. So this fact sheet has been circulated to members of Congress and the Senate. Tomorrow, Hillary Clinton, who's becoming the former Secretary of State, Foreign Minister, she will be questioned in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee about the events of Benghazi in Libya, where the American ambassador and 3 other employees and CIA people were killed by the same Libyans who were supposed to provide security for the American embassy in Benghazi in Libya. And on September 11th, this is called September 11th #2. Like the first one we had in the attack on New York and the United States on 2001, this is called September 11th #2. And all the evidence show that these people were asked by the US government to provide security. And these people are from the Libyan, it's called the Libya Shield. It's a special militant group. And most of its members are members from Al-Qaeda, the former Libyan Al-Qaeda group is called the Libyan Fighting Islamic Group, LIFG. And those people were, after they were armed to overthrow Gaddafi, but after the overthrow of Gaddafi, they were given responsibility for security in Benghazi and Tripoli. Like in Tripoli, Abdul Hakim Belhaj, who is the leader of the LIFG, who was arrested by the CIA and the British MI5 already in 2004, in Thailand, and he was taken by CIA plane given to Gaddafi as a gift, where he was tortured and put in prison in the so-called war on terrorism. The same Belhaj has become the leader of the Security Council, providing security in Tripoli, including. So these are the enemies. Now they are our friends in the fight in Libya and Syria. So the members of the Senate, they got all this information, and it's quite possible, a lot of these discussions coming out even in the media, that the United States government is supporting the same Al-Qaeda groups we say we are fighting against. And this could come up very big in the Senate, because this fact sheet was distributed to members of the Congress and the Senate, and quite widely circulated in Washington. So we can expect things to happen. The day after, John Kerry will be questioned in the Senate, because before he becomes confirmed as foreign minister. All the questions will have, almost all of them will be about the Benghazi crisis, because the United States government and the State Department, they lied about where this attack came from. They said it was an angry mob who were angry about the film about Prophet Muhammad, and they came and demonstrated, and they burned the embassy. This was the official story. But the reality is that this was a group which the United States had supported and armed, and even the US ambassador and the CIA people had met with the same group a few days or the day before the attack. So if these things come up, this will be very big. So President Obama is not going to have his honeymoon, and the policies which he has been trying to avoid, now they will come back to haunt him. And we're going to push this both in the United States and internationally to get the truth about this. It's like we had this whole thing about Mali, what happened in Algeria, and the French intervention in Mali. This is the same thing. This the same groups. This was a consequence of what happened in Libya. The thing is that if the French want to go and fight terrorism, these terrorists in Mali, and get support from Europe, they should, well, stop the terrorists who are fighting in Syria. But they say, no, this is a different story. So if truth is not told about where these things are coming from, and who is financing these groups, who created these groups, we will never be able to solve this. And this is becoming a global problem. All West Africa, the Sahara region, all the way through Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, we're going to have religious wars. And religious wars are the worst type, as Europeans know from their history, the worst type of wars. They never end, because the revenge and blood seeks blood. Yeah. And it takes maybe more than 100 years for that to be resolved. So this is a real problem. I mean, I don't want to go into details of what happened in Mali, but this was a direct consequence of what happened in Libya, because weapons and armed men went from there to northern Mali. The same Tuareg people who were recruited by Gaddafi earlier, they went back to Mali, they had weapons, and they joined the terrorist groups who are supported by Saudi Arabia and Qatar, believing that now it's green light to be part of the Al-Qaeda and get support from the Anglo-Saudis, and then they went to overthrow the government in Mali. So this was a direct consequence of the collapse of the Libyan state. Whatever we think about Gaddafi, that's another story. But what was done to Libya was a crime. We can come back to these details later, because we want to go into what we have to present as an alternative to this crazy policy. We have, we can have the second one. Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who's the leader of the International Schiller Institute, she organized on very short notice a conference in November, inviting international guests and experts from around the world to discuss the alternative to the ongoing wars and the threat of global war. Because as we see in Syria, the reason why, it's not the only reason, but one of the reasons why Syria did not end up like Libya yet, is because Russia and China want to stop this policy, the so-called regime change policy, by force. And they have been standing in the Security Council, international fora, to stop this onslaught on the principle of sovereignty of nation states. The problem is that the NATO, the United States, the British are playing a chicken game with the Russians, see who backs first, by threatening more and more, like moving the Patriot missiles to Turkey, the anti-missile Patriot batteries by NATO to Turkey. So this could lead by miscalculation to a confrontation with Russia and China around the Middle East or Southwest Asia. As I had said many times before, I prefer to say Southwest Asia is more appropriate name than the Middle East, because the Middle East is the name the colonialists gave it. You know, if you look from Britain and France to the world, you have the Near East, you have the Middle East, you have the Far East. But in reality, they are called Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and so on. So I'm going to say Southwest Asia, which is the region of from Afghanistan to Iran, Iraq, Syria. Egypt is considered North Africa. Anyway, so Helga Tseplarouche, she wanted to present something as an alternative to the war. Simultaneously, as we are fighting against the war, we have to provide people and governments an alternative, because peace is not the absence of war. Peace means that nations are set to work to build their future. That's what peace means. And every war, a legitimate war, which does not end by providing the victim nation and the other nations a better future, that's not really a justified war. It's like what happened in Germany after the World War II. The United States set to work to put Germany on their feet again, rebuilding Germany. Japan, the same thing. You know, although they were the aggressors in the war, but they said, if we don't do this, we will have the same problem again. So the idea which Helga Tseplarouche presented is this idea which we call peace through economic development, because that's the ultimate goal of every nation, to give its members, its future generations, its children now, the best possible living conditions and the means for every child to develop their creativity and have the best health care, living conditions, food, and education, so they can become full members of society, creative members of society, so they can contribute to the society now and contribute to the rest of humanity and the future. That's the purpose of nations. The goal is always in the future. It's not now. As people say, I talk a lot about economic development. People think I'm talking about materialist things. Things people can buy. This is not what we mean by economy. Economy is to provide a decent living standard and allow people to develop creatively, morally, culturally, as we focus on classical culture. Anyway, so Helga Tseplarouche wanted a program to counter the war, starting from Southwest Asia, which is the point where we can have global war. So these two things can happen anytime. We can have a global war, a world war, anytime, any moment, because the situation is prepared for that. But the situation is also ripe for a political shift, whether in the United States, in Europe, and Russia, China, India, they support our ideas. That's a fact. But that's also possible now. So we want to present an idea for people and governments on how we can shift this, and instead of people fighting each other, they can unite together against a common enemy. And that common enemy is not another nation.
That's us.
What we call the common enemy in this case is the desert, which can actually unite all nations. And it will have implications even for the future, for human beings coming out from our planet to other planets. You can take a look at the next. You know, the Schiller Institute internationally, before that, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Helga Tseplarouche, the Schiller Institute, have been presenting a number of ideas to rebuild the world economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one of these ideas was what the Chinese called and adopted as their future strategy in 1996 as the Silk Road. And Helga Tseplarouche was a guest at a conference organized by the Chinese government on this idea. It did not include all this, but the idea was to connect China and East Asia to Europe through the old Silk Road, which was there more than 1,000 years ago during the Islamic Renaissance. So this is one of the ideas that we have been pushing, but this idea developed more and more into an idea for connecting actually the whole world with infrastructure corridors. There is a problem here. We can see the next. Is that we have this massive desert region, which extends from North Africa, West Africa and Morocco, all the way through Southwest Asia into Central Asia and into the western side of China, Mongolia, and so on. And this creates a massive problem because it's right in the crossroads of the three continents, and it's also very sensitive areas where both the rich with natural resources, but the water crisis can create massive conflicts among people there. So there's shortage of water, shortage of food, and the desert is expanding and not allowing real development in the region. So we said, okay, this is our common enemy. So what can divide the world can actually unite the world around a common goal. This desert, this is not all desert. Here, for example, we have a desert area, but these other areas, they are called semi-arid and arid areas, where the rainfall is between 250 and 500 milliliters per year. So these are not all desert areas, but they are all affected by a shortage of water. Now, these areas were green about 20,000 years ago. It was beautiful nature, according to geologists, when we had ice up to 3 kilometers in the northern part of Europe at the end of the ice age, when the ice withdrew and the temperatures have been rising since then. It didn't happen with the Industrial Revolution. The climate change has had a very long process, at least more than 12,000 years. We have had this desert developing. So it did not start yesterday, but it's becoming worse and worse because the demand for water, population growth makes it even more urgent to share the same resources that exist there. So the idea to green the desert is based on what Lyndon LaRouche's economic scientific method, which is based on 3 factors which we can use here, is that we take the existing resources and upgrade them, like water, soil, and labor. We can develop these resources because with the state they exist today, they are not sufficient to support population and solve the problem of the desert. The other principle is that we can create new resources, which environmentalists and economists say it's impossible because you have only a limited amount of resources. This is what you can take from the ground. Beyond that, you cannot do that. But we can create new resources, water resources, for example. We can take seawater and desalinate it, take the salt away by using high energy density. And the third principle is to increase the productivity of the economy, what we call the economic platform, by building infrastructure, transport, energy, water, and social and scientific development. That way we can increase the productivity of the economy and of the labor, which is lacking in these regions too. So these are the 3 main principles, and then we have to set to work. The thing is what we can take the next. We have had also these massive crises. Just to give you a picture of the problem, which has been accelerating, is that this is the Lake Chad in the center of the Saharan Africa in Chad. It's shared by Chad, Niger, Nigeria, Cameroon. All these nations share the same lake. This was the 6th largest lake in 1972. And this is how it looks like today. It has been shrinking. People are moving across borders with their animals, with their families, following where the water is, and the water is diminishing. Can go to the next. This is where the Lake Chad is located. This is how big it was in 72. This is how it looked in 2007, and it's becoming even smaller. I can take the next one. This is the Aral Sea in Central Asia, which is between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It also has been shrinking since 1989. This is how it was, and this is how it looks like. And then it left behind a massive salt lake, and there are salt storms that blow over these regions, create massive problems. The problem is that in the Soviet period, they overexploited the water from the Aral Sea to produce cotton. And cotton is the most thirsty type of plant you can use. It consumes 10 or 20 times more than corn or other agricultural products consume. So it basically depleted the whole lake. So you can take the next. We have a recurring problem in the Southwest Asia is the dust and sandstorms. They come with northern winds twice or three times a year. When northern winds come sweeping down the Anatolian mountains in Turkey, and they take with them sand and dust and blow it all over the Gulf region. You can take the next. And this creates massive health problems. It stops airports. Even sometimes they have to shut down schools. It happened in 2011 in the Gulf, in Dubai, in Qatar. And if you look where this thing starts, is exactly in the border between Syria and Iraq. And if you take the next one, which is close up, you see how the wind stirs the soil. Now the problem is that in that region, because also not only the drought, but also the lack of economic development in the last decade, especially in Iraq, because of wars and sanctions, agriculture has collapsed. The water systems have collapsed. And there's a water shortage because of the massive Turkish dam building projects, which we will come to, but it's not the real problem. But the lack of management of the water resources and agriculture is creating more and more arid areas that become subject to these sandstorms. Take the next. This is the same thing continuing into southern Iraq. Next. And then it flows over Qatar, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and take the next. These are satellite images by NASA satellites and the European Agency. And then they take a loop around this area and they dump the sand usually in this called empty quarter, which is the biggest desert in the Arabian desert, very hot area. It's called empty quarter because there's no life there. One thing about these desert areas is that like we have countries like Egypt, which is, you see, we have enormous waste of existing resources. That in Egypt, 90% of the population, who are 80 million, they live only on 5% of the land. So 95% of Egypt is totally empty, it's not used. So people live on the Nile River. If you look at the population density map, everybody, 80 million people on a strip of land and in Cairo. And the problem is that the environmentalists, the UN, and even people in Egypt say Egypt is overpopulated. There are too many people. But the problem is that everybody's in the same room. So if you have 80 million people in one room, that's a problem. So you have to build the country, and I have some things which our friends in Egypt are working on. So these areas are all empty. They can be developed. You can take the next. Yeah, sometimes, you know, they just go over this mountain range and the sand just continues. These are just to give you an idea of the magnitude. The sandstorms are maybe 20, 30 meters high, but dust storms are many kilometers high. So they can be seen from space. You can just roll the next ones. This goes more into Pakistan and India, continues. This was 2011. Afghanistan, Pakistan, the same thing. This Egypt goes the other direction. Sometimes the sandstorms reach Europe. Next, this is China in the desert in the western of China, and it attacks even Beijing and the rest of the populated area. So as we come to this Southwest Asia, this is not, as I said in our conference, this is not the Shiite crescent. People call it the Shia crescent. That Syria, Iran, Iraq, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, they create a Shia against Sunni crescent. This is not it. This is called the Fertile Crescent by historians, because this area was very fertile. The land was very good. People learned agriculture more than 10,000 years ago. Agriculture, they say, started here. The first agriculture on the planet, organized agriculture, started in this region. The problem is that that region is not fertile anymore. You can take the next. So there have been ideas. This is what is fascinating about this project, is that all countries have their programs, they have their projects to fight against the desert, at least to stop the sandstorms and the expansion of the desert. This is from the Iraqi Agriculture Ministry. This has existed for more than 40 years on the drawing boards in the Agricultural Ministry, but it was never implemented because Iraq was busy with all these wars, sanctions, and so on. But this is the idea to build a green belt, it's called, where you build a unified green belt around the population areas. This is all desert area. As we showed, the sandstorm starts here and cuts down there. So to protect the population and cities, the idea was to build a 20-kilometer wide belt of trees to protect the cities. And then you have these smaller ones to protect each city. You can go to the next. This is one of the smaller ones which is being implemented now in a city in Iraq called Karbala. And it's a few hundred meters wide. It should be several kilometers, but it's a good start. It gives an image of... the technique is to use different types of trees that resist heat and saltiness in the ground. And they can resist dry climate. Like olive trees, you have palm trees, you have eucalyptus trees. There's a number of trees that can be planted at certain distances, so they even support each other. You can go to the next. This is the same project when it was started. And what they are doing is that they use water wells. They dig wells in that region to water. This idea of planting a variety of different trees is a very ancient idea. This is from the Egyptian chamber of kings, the graves of the kings, the pharaohs. And this is a painting on the wall, which is maybe 5,000 years ago old. And it shows that you have palm trees, you have other fruit trees, and then you have growing like corn and cereals and so on in the middle. So this is not a new idea. This is also shows how the palm trees, for example, they have a special function which they protect the rest of by creating shadow. They also can create a shield against the sand and so on. And the temperature inside here and outside this is very different. You know, sometimes you can have up to 10 degrees difference if you are inside the garden or if you are outside the garden. So you can plant fruit trees in the shadow of the palm trees. So not only you fight against the sand and the desert, but you can produce food for the population. And Karbala, where I showed, they have very good orange, types of orange, very sweet and tasty. We can take the next. These are palm trees. They are beautiful, they are strong, they live long, and they produce enormous amounts of food, dates, which is a great source of energy and vitamins and minerals. So this is the most common. You can take the next. This is in China. They tried to stop the sand from moving by building these sections of old dry trees and bushes and so on. And this is also an old technique. You can take the next one. This is from the 1950s in Libya. The idea is not only to stop the sand, and what we need to do is we have to bring water infrastructure into that system, bring water there and plant trees, not just to have a defensive strategy. We have to have an offensive strategy to stop the desert. This is a project in China, in the West Chinese. This is a highway, a very important highway, connecting Western China to Eastern China. And what they do to stop, because the sand moves, like when in the north we have the snow drifting on the roads, here we have the sand moves and blocks the roads and creates massive problems. So they plant these trees that resist both the dry climate and also the saltiness of the land, and they dig wells to produce water. It's salty water, it's not very good water, but they develop the types of plants that can resist salty. So what you need is scientific research, agricultural research, to develop new types of plants that can live in this climate and with little water resources. So the question now is, where do we get all the water for these things? Because these areas are dry, there isn't much water. So what we have in this plan is we have three basic preliminary sources of water. We can divert water from other regions. We have regions in the world, and even next to these regions that are rich with water, but the water ends up in the sea. It's not used. There's too much of it. That's one source. The second source is we can desalinate seawater, which exists all over the Southwest Asia and around Africa in the seas. It's salty. We need new energy to desalinate, takes the salt out. And then we can use the groundwater, which I'll come to. So some of the big water diversion projects, this is called the NAWAPA, North American Water and Power Alliance, it's called. And the idea is to divert water from the Yukon River and I think Mackenzie River that flow in Alaska into the Arctic Sea, and by building a series of dams and canals and pumping stations, you can move only 5% of that water through a tunnel and channel system over the Rocky Mountains down to the American desert, which showed that you have a massive desert area and also creating a big food crisis in the world, that the drought there is destroying American agriculture. America, the United States, is an important source of food actually for the world. So agriculture is being affected. Mexico has a massive drought problem. So the idea is that you move water, but what you do in the process, this, according to our studies, there's a full report, and the LaRouche-Bach organization, which is also being used to mobilize Congress, industries, and population to support this idea. This will immediately give the United States 2 million productive jobs. It will revolutionize the whole US economy. It will be like the mobilization Franklin Roosevelt did under World War II, where every source in the country was put into factories, in building roads and dams to support the war effort. This will be a war not against another nation, it will be a war to support and save the United States economy. This is one of the big projects. It was started, the study was done in the 1960s. John Kennedy supported this project. And there are politicians who supported him, but then he was killed and it was sabotaged. But we want to revive it. The next, there are two important water projects which we support in Africa. They are water diversion projects. This is called Transaqua, where the Lake Chad I showed is drying up. And the idea is to move 1/5 of the water from the Congo River, which has the watershed area here in eastern Congo, in the eastern Congo, and the water flows into the Atlantic Sea. It's enormous amounts of water. It is the second largest river in the world after the Amazon River. And it also creates massive problems of the rain season for creating floods and so on. But the idea is if you divert only 1/5 of the water already here and let it go into a canal across a small mountain range into the Central African Republic, into a river here, and then it will flow naturally down to the Lake Chad. The feasibility studies for this project was done by an Italian engineering company, Mr. Marcello Vichi, who's a friend of the Schiller Institute. He has been fighting for this more than 30 years. He went to and met with African leaders. They've been campaigning for this. And the feasibility studies are done. This could be done. It could be done very quickly and very easily. He himself traveled in the jungle just to find out the locations where this canal could be built. And this will be important for many nations, millions of human beings, but it will even lead to changing the climate, which I will come to later with the idea that nature can take the process further on its own when we have created the conditions for plants and rain to fall on these regions again. But we have to first create the right conditions for the rain to come by creating a milder climate, lower temperatures, and more moisture in the atmosphere. So these also have the ideas for building canals into North Africa and also desalinate seawater. And then we can connect also different parts of Africa with other infrastructure projects. We can take next. This is called the Africa Pass. It's an Egyptian engineer called Ayman Rashid. He's a friend of us. He was in our conference in Germany recently and presented his idea. He has a big campaign in Egypt to get the government. He actually is asking the president to appoint him as Minister of Transport, because he says this can save the Egyptian economy, which is collapsing right now, and help all these other nations by building high-speed railway connections from Somalia and the Great Lakes regions who are landlocked. They produce a lot of food actually in these areas, but they cannot export them. They cannot transport because you don't have transport and storage systems. There's no energy, no transport system. So he says we can help these nations have a connection directly on the Mediterranean where foodstuff and fruits can be exported to Europe very, very quickly. But then you open all these regions for economic development. Combined with this, he wants to build a water canal which will flow from the Great Lakes region and also from Eastern Congo parallel to the Nile and create new build new cities, spread agriculture, and bring water to the Qattara Depression. There's a big hole in western Egypt, it's called a depression, a very large area, which was a lake before. Geologists say, and he said you can.
The Rift Valley. Is that what you mean?
No, the Rift Valley is in the Sinai area, but this is like a huge old lake. It's a very depressed area, about 80 meters deep. And he said we can refill it, but also have a lot of agriculture in that region. And then his idea is, which adopts the idea from the Schiller Institute, that Egypt can connect Asia with Europe and Africa. So Egypt has a very special position here. So this is the second water diversion and infrastructure project. Can take the next. I think we had if it works, I don't know, this is an animation. Can you click on the picture itself? This is how it should develop over a 50 years period. Maybe it's not. Yeah. These are the railway connections. Nuclear power, small-scale nuclear power plants for. Oh, sorry. And then it becomes green. So this has been actually I've been working on this for many years with African nations, African leaders, but it's being sabotaged the whole time. I mean, Europe is not really interested in developing that part of the world. The policy is the same. You can just take. There's natural resources you can take, like Mali and Niger. Now the big crisis in France because of the uranium, which is the largest deposits of uranium are in Niger and in Mali. But the policy from Europe has been, the whole time, since the old colonialism, is you just take from Africa and you keep it underdeveloped. And if you can use other nice arguments like preserving nature and animals to stop infrastructure development plans. When nations want to build, even without help from Europe, like Ethiopia and Sudan, they're building water dams on the Nile. And there are massive campaigns in Europe and the United States to stop these projects. So not only they don't want to help build these projects, they want to sabotage them. They want to keep these nations poor and dependent. But now there are certain things happening where the Chinese are coming in and say...
It's going to change the whole situation in Africa, I think.
Yeah, we hope so, but we hope that Europe changes its policy because this is a massive problem. It needs more than China to solve because we have enormous industrial scientific potential in Europe, which is now becoming unemployed because of the economic crisis. Because some of our members, they made the calculations, what will this take to build these things in Europe? And they made calculations that they will have to build new ports in Germany. I mean, Germany has enormous ports in Hamburg, but Germany, just to support these projects, they will have to build new ports, they will have to build new industries in Germany to build these projects. So not only in Africa, but it can revolutionize and give Europe a totally different mission now than we have had for many years. Change Europe's relationship to... But the Chinese are doing things actively, but it's not enough. They build dams, they build railways. They say, okay, we need copper, we need oil, we need gold, and so on for their own development. But at least they say we can give you something back. Well, Europe, they don't take anything. And even the money which is given to these countries is taken back to Europe, either to pay debt or corrupt leaders can put them in European banks. So Africa doesn't get anything from that. So we can take the next. I mean, in Afghanistan, I was looking at Afghanistan. Who's doing investments in Afghanistan? The United States and NATO have been there now 11 years. They haven't built anything. Maybe some school here and there. The Chinese are the only ones that are building anything and investing in Afghanistan, because there's maybe the world's largest copper mine is in the south of Kabul, and lithium mines out there. Afghanistan is a very, very rich country with minerals, and the Chinese are already preparing themselves when the United States and NATO leave in 2014, that they will have a totally different situation, and that way they can also stop terrorism from spreading into China and Central Asia by developing Afghanistan. And they are investing heavily, not only in mines. They build water dams, they build railways connections. Even Iran is investing on its border with Afghanistan, building railways and new cities and so on. So this is the right policy to fight terrorism. You know, you develop the country, you develop a middle class, you educate the people, then the extremists won't have enough space to move. Another water diversion, this is from the Soviet time. This is already 1963. Under Stalin, Russian engineers had the plan to move water from these rivers. It's called the Ob and Irtysh rivers. They flow that direction into the Icy, and then you have another river here. It's called Pechora. These are the Aral Mountains. So they have two watersheds. So they built a dam here. They moved the water into the Volga. It should come this way, actually, not this way. And then you have the Ob-Irtysh rivers where they meet. They can build a dam and a canal, which is about 3,000 kilometers, to bring water back to the Aral Sea, which I showed was drying up. So this idea existed, but it was never built. Because this area is very good for agriculture. It's a mild, dry climate. As you bring water, you will have an enormous... So you can take the next. This is a project which we have been looking at Iran and Afghanistan. I discovered that Iranian engineers, since the 1970s, have a plan there are these two big deserts in Iran. This whole area is a dry area, but these are big deserts. And they cut the nation here in the middle. And the idea is to bring water, to build a canal from the Caspian Sea to fill the desert. This is salt water. And then from the Arabian Sea. So you can use this canal for navigation, for transport into Russia from India. The Indians have been very active there's a port here in southern Iran. It's called Shah Bahar, which India now uses. It's completed now, to transport goods to Eastern Europe and Russia. It takes about 1 week by train, but by boat to go around the Red Sea, Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, it takes 3 weeks. So from an economic standpoint, it's a great advantage for India. It's also a good advantage for Iran. And also you can complete this with building water canals where ships can go all the way to the Volga and into Russia, which is even a much cheaper way of transporting bulk goods. But what this creates, you can create a new climate. Because the reason you don't have rain in these areas is that it's hot climate and there's no moisture in the air. That's what you need to have rain. You need moisture, you need cold fronts, and you create the rain. So their idea is that the water which evaporates from this can make the climate milder, increase the moisture, increase rainfall. And this will affect even Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, we have a big crisis, not only because of the war. We have the opium production in Afghanistan has increased 8 times since NATO went in. And it's the biggest exporter of opium and heroin in the world. In Russia, Russian government say that about 30,000 Russians die because of drugs every year. Yeah. And this is a war. 30,000 people die without even one shot fired from Afghanistan. But by NATO allowing drugs to go, and this is being grown, the opium is being grown and exported and developed into heroin in NATO-controlled areas, especially in southern Afghanistan where the British have their bases. And they allow it. I mean, the British, they had a funny operation. They cut all the corn fields in that region. And their explanation was that the corn fields are too high and the terrorists can hide in them. You know, and put bombs there when the British soldiers. You know, they said it like a military officer. So they cut a lot of corn farms on the main roads. But the opium is... yeah, anyway, but this can change a lot of things in that part. So the idea, if you imagine, I don't know, we don't have to go back, you have this desert which is extending, and it has an accumulative power. It supports itself. It creates new climate patterns where the desert itself grows like a living organism. So what you need to do is you cut that organism into smaller sections, smaller pieces, and then you attack it, as we said, in Africa, the Transaqua, the Chad Lake, in North Africa, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and then you make a section here. So the desert becomes smaller and smaller sections, and you then attack it where the effect becomes easier to deal with the desert, rather than you have to deal with several thousand kilometers. You start to deal with hundreds of kilometers, which becomes much easier economically to deal with. So the Iranian ambassador who was in our conference, he actually said, we have done a feasibility study on this and it will be built soon. The Iranian government, they inaugurated a project in this region, in Gorgan, I think it's called, last year, but it's not to build a canal. They built a water desalination plant run by natural gas to produce, I don't know, maybe 50 million cubic meters of water, which will be transported to these cities that are on the same desert area. But it would be good to build the canal, and then you can build desalination plants nearby instead of transporting the water all the way. So you can produce water here for these local areas.
What about the Caspian Sea? Is that salt water or is it fresh water?
It's salt water.
It is salt water.
Yeah. Also, I mean, there's fresh water running in from the Volga.
Yeah, from the Volga.
Yeah. So it's a huge sea.
It's like a
difficult.
lake, in fact. In fact, it's a big lake.
It's a big lake, yeah. It's a big lake. I think it's the biggest lake in the world. Anyway, this is we have other projects. We're talking about this Turkish project. It's called the GAP, Southeastern Anatolian Project. They have been, since 1980s, building a series of dams on the Tigris and Euphrates. And both the energy production and agricultural production in this area has exploded, and the massive infrastructure. We can show a picture of the Ataturk Dam. This is a massive water dam, Ataturk Dam, on the Euphrates, and it produces electricity for about like 4 big nuclear power plants, like 4,000 megawatts effect. And the lake it has created, it's enormous amount of water behind the dam. That's why before it was finished, we created a certain shortage in the water running to Syria and Iraq. I mean, there have been agreements before, but since Iraq has been attacked and Syria is being attacked, the Turks don't want to worry about talking to the Iraqis and Syrians anymore about sharing the water, how to do this in a reasonable way. It's not wrong to build water dams, but then you have to think about your neighbors. So this is the type of projects we encourage, but then it has to be done in a systematic way. Another problem the Turks have, which is being encouraged by the United States, is that in this region they are concentrating on production of cotton for export. Turkey exports a lot of garments and clothes and so on, and it's becoming dependent on that. But the problem is that the cotton consumes enormous amounts of water. So actually it's not cheap production, it's very, very expensive production. Because if you think about the water as an important resource, this cotton is very, very expensive. So they should change their policy into producing food which consumes less water, and it's more necessary for the populations both in the region, in Africa, and in the world. So we can go to the next. This was an idea they called the peace pipeline. It was already there in the 80s. The Turkish government proposed it to take water from two other rivers, not that this is the Euphrates and Tigris, but there are two other rivers called Ceyhan and Ceyhan, which flow into the Mediterranean. And their idea is to transfer water to Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and then to the other Gulf countries. The Turkish idea, they want to export water and get oil, for example, for that. But it's a commercial project. But this is one of the things that could help during the peace process before it collapsed between the Israelis and the Palestinians and Arabs. This became popular, but then now it's forgotten. But this is the kind of project that exists there. They can be built very easily. I can take the next.
Yeah, I just comment that this name there, Oasis Plan, that's the name that LaRouche has been campaigning for these water projects as the key to peace in the region.
Yes. From
at least 1975.
Yes, this is the whole, the many projects actually. I can take the next where it's the next one. This is specifically the Oasis Plan for the Palestinians and Israel. And the idea is to build a water canal from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is about 400 meters below sea level. It's a very, very low area. And then you build a canal from the Red Sea, or Mediterranean to Dead Sea, and then from the Red Sea to the Dead Sea. Even the water is becoming less in the Dead Sea. It's not only dead, it's becoming smaller. It's very, very salty water. Maybe if you have traveled to the Dead Sea, if you don't swim, you can float because it's so thick with salt and minerals. Anyway, the idea is to both refill the water, but then you can use the difference in the height between these seas and this low point to generate hydropower. And you use that hydropower for electricity, but also you can use it for desalinating seawater, the salty water, by the so-called reverse osmosis process. It's like pushing the water through a filter to take the salt out, but it needs enormous pressure, and that pressure needs electricity. So this idea, also the idea, LaRouche's idea to build nuclear power plants, small-scale nuclear power plants with high-temperature reactors that are inherently safe. The previous picture, this is a picture of a Russian plant. Now it exists. They have these in the Arctic Sea in northern Siberia, where remote areas of Russia, small cities and towns, they build a floating nuclear power plant. It's a ship basically, and it's docked outside the port in a protected area, and it produces both heat and electricity for the local community. These are small-scale nuclear power plants, 100, 200 megawatts. The large ones we have here in Sweden is like 1,000 megawatts. These are much smaller, but they are more practical for these remote areas. And the idea is to use the similar type of reactors, but high-temperature reactors, which are a different technique for Southwest Asia and North Africa. Okay, go next. So this is the second source. We said we divert water from water-rich areas to water-poor areas. That's one way to bring water. The second one is to desalinate seawater. In the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they produce more than half of the global water, fresh water from the sea. No, 2/3. And Saudi Arabia produces 1/2 of the world total fresh water from the sea. And they're investing enormous amounts of, they're building massively in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar. 70% of the drinking water in Saudi Arabia comes from desalinated seawater. The problem is that they have to burn about 1.5 million barrels of oil or equivalent of gas to produce that water. That's enormous. In the coming 10, 15 years, the water demand will triple. So you have to imagine that they have to pump and burn 4 or 5 million barrels of oil just to produce drinking water. So this is not really a sustainable policy, although it sounds impressive. So they have to resort to nuclear power. Now, the United Arab Emirates are building nuclear power. They have 4 big nuclear power plants being built by South Korea in Abu Dhabi. Saudi Arabia have a plan to build they say, 60 nuclear power plants. We don't know if that's going to happen, but because to do that, you need not only get foreign companies to build it, you have to educate your population and have engineers, have a school system which will support such high technological demand. You cannot live by bringing foreign companies in all, eternity to build and run things for you, and have your own youth being unemployed, so they go to religious schools instead. I mean, they get paid some money, but they go and spend their time in mosques and religious schools, and they become fanatics. And this is a big problem for Saudi Arabia. So instead, what they should do is they should have modern education for their youth and good productive employment for the young Saudis, so they don't have to think about these other crazy things. But the policy has been, Saudi Arabia is part of the empire. It's an integral part of the empire. It's not like an agent of the empire. Saudi Arabia and the British Empire, they are inseparable. They are one entity, unfortunately. But there's a possibility if they want to change. Can take the next. Then we have the third source of water is groundwater. And of course, we hear the whole time, if you go to water conferences organized by the UN or the EU, they say, well, we need to use groundwater in these areas. That's the only source we have. But it's limited. So we should not have a lot of agriculture. We just build some pumps here and there so people can have some drinking water. But forget about economic development using this water. And the reason they say it because the amount of water in these so-called aquifers, shallow aquifers, is limited. It is renewable, but it's very little water compared to what you need beyond drinking. You need for agriculture, industrial use, urban use, take a shower or toilet, and you have many industries use water. But they say this is the only source of water, and it should be used very carefully. In Gaza, we have a deep crisis now. In Gaza, the United Nations itself say by 2020, Gaza will be unlivable because people will not be able to live in Gaza. They have to move somewhere else because the water, groundwater people use for drinking is depleted. The Israelis took most of it before they left. And the aquifer is destroyed because you have intrusion of seawater. If you pump a lot of water, then you have water coming from other regions and pollute that water. Now, there are a lot of people get sick. Children in Gaza get sick. It's called the blue baby because there's enormous amount of natrium in the water. And mostly children get sick. So it's true. If this is the only source of water, then we will not be able to do it. And they say this is the only groundwater available in the world. But based on scientific investigations, there's a different theory. Using space technology, we have scientists who say this traditional theory is nonsense. Yes, it exists, but there's another source of groundwater, which you can see in the next. I go back to the first one. The theory of the shallow aquifers that it rains in the high areas, and then the water flows over land and ends up in runoff in the sea or in the river. Then some of the water comes in the sediment in the soil and is trapped here between the bedrock areas where you have rock and this soil. So it creates a reservoir of water. It's called a shallow aquifer. And this is what people dig. It goes between 10 meters and 50 meters, that's the level of it. And it's refilled if you have enough water, rain falling, it's refilled gradually. But if you have economic development and population growth, this is not going to be enough. So the next one says, we have scientist Dr. Farouk Al-Baz, who worked with the NASA. He mapped the surface of the moon for the Apollo landing using remote sensing technology. So he told the American astronauts where to land. He worked in NASA, he's Egyptian. He works now in the Boston University Remote Sensing Center. And he used space technology to determine his theory. He and a friend of his called Robert Bisson. And they say, in addition to this, we have another phenomena taking place, is that because the mountain areas in the most parts of Earth, because of thousands of years of tectonic shifts and movements, have created cracks in the rock formations, mostly vertical cracks. And these cracks are used by the rainwater as canals to go into much, much deeper regions below this rock bed area, which they allege there's only water above it. But this water goes deeper under that, and it can travel for hundreds of kilometers too. So you have water reservoirs, and they discovered water reservoirs in Darfur in Sudan. There's an enormous water reservoir in Libya, in Kufra. This is where these Libya Shield terrorists have controlled that area, because that's where the so-called man-made river comes from. You have a map of that. So we can go next one. This is in the Saudi desert. They also discovered under the empty quarter. Now they are digging for water using the same theory. Next one. Here in eastern Libya, you have these are underground rivers, but above these rivers you have, and they start from these mountain areas. When it rains, these travel below the ground. So the Gaddafi's, under Gaddafi's time in the 1990s, they asked a Korean company to build water pumps and a pipe system. You can see it by satellite from Google Earth. If you zoom in, you see formations of the problem is that they transport the water away from the desert to Sirte and Benghazi for drinking. But these are enormous amounts of water they pump. I mean, the pipes are about 8 meters in diameter, which the Koreans built. And there's a lot of water. Now, the traditional theory says, well, this water exists in these reservoirs very deep below ground, but this water was conserved from the Ice Age times, because you had rain in this area, as we said, during the Ice Age. We had lakes here, and the water was dripping down the soil, and it takes hundreds of years to come all the way down to these reservoirs. But this is old water, it's fossil water, which is reserved in these reservoirs, and they are not rechargeable. So if you take it out, that's it, there's no more water. You may wait 2 million years more, maybe there's another ice age. But these scientists say this is not completely true. There is water which was conserved in the soil, but this water is being recharged from the mountain areas. And therefore, it's safe to use that water. Now, of course, we don't want to rely on that. I said we have other sources. But to start our war on the desert, we need to use that water and not take it to the coast. Use it in the desert areas and have agriculture.
Yes, but if you look at the climate in Libya and Egypt, it's very arid, dry and desert. How can it rain in the mountains?
Well,
because of the high altitude.
Yeah, in the high altitudes, you always have rain in these areas.
Oh.
So sometimes there's floods, but they come suddenly and they disappear. It's like the Namibia in the desert, all animals and people, they wait for 1 week a year where it rains in the mountains and then comes the flood.
Yeah, the problem is that you cannot use the water.
You do not.
Most of it is spoiled. Or,
Yeah, it's
disappear.
right. So it does rain in the high ranges of mountains, and this is what the mega watershed theory. They say most of the water which goes down, it rains and snow and the high range of the mountains, which is usually not accounted for meteorological. But there is an enormous environmentalist campaign, and in the United Nations, they want to prevent the nations of Africa from using that water. Because they say this is for the future generations, you should not use it now. But what we want to do, we're going to give future generations, if we start this now, we will give them a planet without these terrible deserts. As they say in the Bible, we'll give them green pastures. They will not have to walk in the shadow of the valley of death, as is happening now. So this is another source? Well, ultimately, the final source of the water is when we start building these green areas, it will change the climate. You will have more moisture, you'll have more rain, and then gradually you can end that problem. So the idea is that you can get nations working together, because no nation can do this by their own. This is a planetary magnitude project. It's not a simple thing. The United Nations maybe have some nice projects here and there, but they will not help. You have to have a collective effort, a massive war on the desert. I think we should soon. And this is the Darfur water. Farouk al-Baz discovered this. He went to Sudan, said that the war in Darfur is about water. You all heard about the war in Darfur. They say it's ethnic cleansing. It was all about water and how it started. And Farouk al-Baz told the Sudanese government, go and dig 100 wells. They will last 100 years. You can solve your problem. So this is the area where there was an ancient lake under it. So we need space technology. We need science. We can go next. This is agriculture in the desert. This is a Saudi project. But this failed because they tried to produce wheat and export wheat to the world. So it was a big, prestigious project in the 80s. So Saudi Arabia went from importing wheat to exporting wheat to the world. And they used enormous amounts of water and the soil in the middle of the desert. And this is Ha'il, this is in the north, central north. And the problem is that they only produce wheat. And then when they deplete an area, they move to the next area. So they create no climate, a shift in the climate in the region. Because they don't plant trees. You can look at the, maybe next. So these huge sprinkler system pivots. This is very efficient technology for irrigation. But the problem is that the water then disappears, either in the product itself, or it evaporates without creating an impact on the climate. What is required is like the old Egyptians used to do. You have to plant trees in these areas. And this is something they are doing now in southern Egypt, where they combine wheat production with planting trees. Because the trees have that effect on the climate. They can change the climate, not these kinds of projects. So this is what they did. Now they are shutting down all this and they're importing wheat again. Because they say the water and energy and money we use producing this is not cost effective. If we import the wheat, it will be cheaper. And so we can take next. So you have to combine these things. Yeah, these are the areas where the wheat production was in Saudi Arabia, and this is the area where the sandstorm passed by, and you can see they cannot stop them. There are other agricultural techniques using greenhouses. It's called hydroponics. You plant directly in water. You don't waste any water because the water is recycled, does not evaporate. Because for vegetable production in the Middle East, people produce vegetables by the rivers, and they have these canals, and to water the plants, they open the canal and they flood the whole field, but the plants take only 2% of that water. The rest of the water evaporates or goes into the soil and creates a salinity problem. So this is a more efficient, but this is part of space technology actually. The idea was how you grow food without soil in spaceships and But this is being used in the United Arab Emirates. You plant directly in water, and the water which evaporates is recycled. But the problem does not create a change in the climate outside the greenhouse. Can I take the next? These are the same. These are the hydroponic. They flush water on the plants. This is more effective using water. You can take the next. Now this is the important thing we need to do. You don't need to use water, flood the whole place. You take these plastic pipes with pumping stations and you drip the water on the plant itself, on the tree itself, and goes directly to the root. So this way you can save 80–90% of the water and it becomes more efficient. The Israelis are very good in this. They have developed this technology. They can help the Arab countries with that and have it as a basis for peace. You can take next one. This is even more efficient. You can directly drip the water on the roots of the plants, but you have to build the infrastructure before planting. These are all techniques. there's a transport thing which I wanted to go through, but Lyndon LaRouche was in Abu Dhabi in 2002 in the Zayed Center. Now that center was shut down a year later, and there was a big crisis because the government of the United States, the government of Britain, they didn't want LaRouche invited in this conference because this was a very important conference about the future of oil. And this is the oil minister of the United Arab Emirates. And in front of Mr. LaRouche, you have the whole Emirati government and oil ministers from many countries. And then the people in the US State Department and the British Foreign Office said, LaRouche is going to speak here. So they called this man and they told him, LaRouche is crazy, don't invite him, you know, we don't want him there. And then they got other embassies to call. And I met him later, and he said, what is it about LaRouche that all these superpowers are scared about? He's an old man, you know. Why are they so hysterical about him coming speaking at a conference? And I told him, well, the problem is that it's the power of ideas. They are scared of the ideas. Not LaRouche has no armies, he doesn't have weapons, you know. But ideas can change people. They can change nations. And this is what scares them. They're afraid of the ideas. And also, LaRouche and our organization can impact people and politics in very special ways. We don't have any secret conspiracies. We talk to people openly what our intentions are. And LaRouche in this conference, he spoke about the Middle East or Southwest Asia as a crossroads of the continents. He said, the future of your region is not in oil. Stop exporting oil, stop burning oil. Use nuclear power, use the oil as an industrial base for chemical and petrochemical and plastic industries. It's stupid to burn oil for energy because oil is an industrial raw material. You can use it and you can become the world's best nations in plastics, packaging. If you go to any hospital here, everything is plastics, except for the beds. All the materials are plastic. Even cars today are being, you know, fiberglass and plastics. They go into everything. Plastics is going everywhere, also other chemical industries. So he said you should build nuclear power, you should use the oil and natural gas for develop your own chemicals industry. And he said you can use your position as a crossroads between three continents. That's a great advantage for your economy. So this scared the hell out of many people, and there was a big campaign against this center in the media and the, governments. And then they shut it down. They shut it down after the invasion of Iraq. We had many conferences there. We presented our ideas there many times. Anyway, so these ideas are known there in that region. It's just that these governments are part of a global policy which does not like this kind of ideas. They don't want nations to be independent and develop. So I was going to go into the transport part of it, but we don't need it. We have gone through, and you can just go quickly. This is a petrochemical industry. It's not necessary to go through it and just explain it. And this is how this region will be then. With the transport corridor networks, with the water projects, we can revolutionize the economy there. We can create peace, economic development. If we don't do this, the alternative is in the next. This is what the British economists said in 2009, that we can have 100 years war, religious wars in the region, and this is what's going on now. That's the alternative if we don't change the policy. But we can do something about the policy and change it so we can have nations instead of destroying each other. They help each other to develop. I think that's enough for my presentation. So.
So we have questions and discussion, and before we start the questions, I have a little advertisement. We need your help. We need everyone to become a member of the Schiller Institute, to subscribe to our publications, to help us speak about these ideas, both the danger of war and the alternative, what future we can actually build if we gather the political will to do so. So we have, you can become member at the table, and also this pamphlet we printed up special for this meeting, which has the text of Hussein's speech at the conference in Germany. It has this speech of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, and it has the fact sheet about the terrorism, and also the speech by the Egyptian engineer about the Africa Pass program, and also Lyndon LaRouche. So that's also available there. So, questions, comments?
Yes, what about the population fund? Because we don't have enough, we can't produce enough for all these people.
Oh,
so we have to send them to Mars, or what do we have to send
no,
them?
that's why I took the example of Egypt. 80 million people.
That's right.
80 million people live on 5% of the land. What we can do is that we can, if you look at this desert area, it's 13 million square kilometers. Then if you compare that area to the population areas in the world, China, India, Europe, Western Europe is the most populated part of the world per square meter.
Density. Population density.
Density, yes. And the United States, if you compare that area, that desert area can have 6 billion more people living there with a decent living standard if it's developed. Resources are not limited. Resources can be created. If we use our creativity, if we use scientific development, what we call natural resources will change. We have very clear examples from our ancestors. If you look at the base of natural resources for a man from the Stone Age, what was the base of the resources? They also said we have limited resources. But what did they burn for fuel? You know, they had just to pick wood. But then you take 100 or 200 years later, 1,000 years later, the base of what we call natural resources changed completely. We have totally new resources which did not exist previously. And then with the Industrial Revolution, which followed the European Renaissance, and we have the Industrial Revolution, we have created or developed new resources which were never known to the human race before. So the limit on natural resources is a limit of the technology and the level of knowledge we have. It's not the resources that are limited in the ground, it's our knowledge which is limited. So what we can do is we can develop our knowledge of these resources and technologies of creating new resources, and then we can change the whole map.
I think also if you get a good development starting in the Middle East and in other poor areas in the world, the population bomb will be demontated, because you see in all countries that when people's living standard go up, there not be so many children.
That's right.
This is the power.
Yeah, you take
in old days in Denmark 200 years ago, it was in the countryside, people get 8 or 10 children. That's not normal today.
Yeah, because of poverty.
And then the same thing will happen in the Middle East, I'm sure.
Yes, you will have a bit of a leveling up of the extremes, but
yes.
You cannot, if you reduce population growth, you create a crisis on the opposite direction, where you have an aging population which cannot be
Of course not
supported.
like it will come like a natural thing of the growing standard in the people.
Yes,
people by nature will not need and have so many children like they have now in poor areas.
Yes, your priority is to develop the living standards of the people and give them education and give them the means of a decent living. And then that process will take care of itself. Natural reproduction, this is a norm in nature. We cannot just change it, but what we can do is that we can you change the behavior of people, because the reason why people needed 10 children here in Europe, because most of them would die before the age of 5. The rest that you need to work in the field. But when the economy develops, children don't die easily. Hope we are grateful for.
You see it already now in some good developing African nations. You see that the number of children go down from just in one generation. It can fall from 6, 8 children to 2 or 3.
Yeah, but we shouldn't be scared by that. Human beings are a resource.
Yeah.
More children is more resources. Not in a materialistic view, but in a real sense.
The sense of ideas.
Yes, exactly. And people who can solve problems if they are giving a decent education and living conditions. So that, and also we human beings, as the German space pioneer, he says it's a natural part of human beings and society to explore new places. You know, we explore new land, we explore new continents, but it's even natural for us to explore other planets. You know, this is our next step. It's natural, it's not artificial, that we want to go somewhere else and build a civilization. And this should be the goal, is not saying, oh, what are the problems if we do this or that? You know, we have to have an objective, we have to have a mission, which is not just 1 year or 10 years or even 50 years. We have to have a mission for the human race into the future. We do what our part and we let the others do their part. But what we do, we take what our predecessors gave us, we make it better, we make it more beautiful, and we deliver it to the others. Then we leave some notes for them, how to deal with it, how we successfully made it, and some ideas and tips, and then they continue. But you need to give them a great culture based on ideas, beautiful ideas, so that you know that this will be sustained, it will continue.
All these ideas are very costly,
Yeah.
right?
Well, they don't cost in what sense?
Well, you have to finance all the pumps, all the railroads, all the
Yes.
infrastructure that you talked about.
Yeah.
And to me, it seems pretty costly.
Yeah, that's...
How does that link with your 3-step of how to, what you say, to control the financial market?
Yes,
Because somebody has to pay that, and as I can see, no country alone have enough money to do this. So they have to use the money in the world, and they are funded by everybody else.
Yeah, well, it depends on what your definition of money is, because money is not...
But you said that the infrastructure has to be funded or
that's
by
right.
the governments.
Yes, if we go back to the 3 steps, sorry, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Those money could get from ending wars, first of all.
Well, that's a good idea. But the thing is, what we do it the way people did it. That's why we take the example of the United States. That the United States, in different stages of its history, managed to create what we call money out of even debt. Because you take the power of the government and you take the power of the idea of that you have to build a society and develop a society. That's your credit. And then you create the means of financing the types of projects. That's why we say, first of all, we take all the fictitious money out of the system. Money is being printed, produced. We take that out. That has no value. The only money which has value is money which is created for a purpose of development of society. And governments, like the government of the United States, according to the Constitution, and what Alexander Hamilton did, is that can use that future credit of your nation to produce monetary value, so-called money, or debt, actually. All new money is a type of debt to the future. But based on your plans for using that money in developing the productivity of society, then you know that this debt will be many times, redeemed before even it should be paid. So the government of a people have the right to produce the financial resources or the money based on its credit that it has a mission, a plan to develop certain areas of the economy. This is what the United States did after the Liberation Wars. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, he established, I think, the first national bank of the United States. And all the states of the United States, they had just come out of the war with the British, and they were completely bankrupt. They had enormous amounts of debt because they needed to finance their war of liberation. And he said, well, no problem. We take that debt and put it in one package, and then we issue new debt based on our idea to rebuild the country. And then the government and the Congress, or the elected, in the case of the Congress, they can actually let the US government produce that credit, so-called money, and circulate it either directly through government institutions to finance specific infrastructure projects, or through private banking system, which will loan that money to people and companies who will build these national projects. But first you have to have an idea what you want to do with your nation. What is this nation's mission is and purpose? What do you need to build and produce? And then based on that intention, you can create credit or debt to finance these things. And then you use the rest of the resources, because you have private resources, deposits of people, all kinds of things you have in society, but you have to channel them into the right investment. It should be productive investment. Right now we have money is worthless, actually, basically, if you go to a strict economic measurement of the value of all the money which is in the world. There's no, if you even include the debt, it's like the Greek debt. It's many, many times larger than the whole Greek economy for many, many years. So how did that happen? What did they buy to, to have all that debt now? It's all fictitious debt. It has no value. The only debt which has value is the debt which a government or a nation takes based on its intention to develop that economy, based on this type of infrastructure projects. And of course, nations can even help each other. It's like the Marshall Plan. I mean, the Marshall Plan, the United States did not pay money. They just guaranteed. They said, don't worry, go build this, we pay you. You know? And they didn't have to pay it. Because what you do is that you put society to work.
It was actually credit for buying U.S. tractors and U.S. equipment. Yeah,
you relaunch the economy, and then it takes a life of its own. But the idea was clear. You rebuild the economy of the nation. And then you take that debt and destroy it later. It becomes...
But how will you finance it? I mean, all these projects, how will you do it?
Yeah, well, we have, like in the case of Nawapa.
Yeah, but you told us about Africa, how you could solve the problem of Africa.
Yeah, well, the African nations, they won't be able to do this on their own, of course. So therefore, we are talking about some sort of a Marshall Plan. But then in each of these nations, we have actually resources. But they can also do the same thing. If we have a world economic and financial system which is based on these ideas, then the major powers will even allow the smaller nations, or the nations who are not so developed right now, to do the same thing. They can even acquire credit and guarantees to start launching national development programs, long-term credit agreements, based on what these nations can pay back when they have stood on their own feet.
Yes.
I mean, the Chinese do that.
Yes.
The Chinese do this in Africa. They don't get money. I mean, they built one of the largest dams in Sudan. I went there and visited it in Sudan. And the Chinese did not take money. They provided the credit from their own banking system as guarantees to the Chinese companies who built the project, and also European companies who built the project. And they had an agreement to get oil from Sudan when the oil is developed in the future. You know? So Sudan did not have to pay so much money to build the dam. The Chinese did not pay so much. I mean, they paid a portion because you need to buy equipment and so on, and pay companies who are not government companies, and they build these things. So the real question is, what do you want to do? And then the next question is, say, okay, how do we finance that? what kind of agreements we have within the nation and among nations to finance these kinds of projects, knowing that these will be productive, these will be successful. It's not like an adventure.
But you have to be sure that your project is going to be successful. Otherwise,
yes,
it can be a failure. So it is some kind of dangerous. But you can say, as the situation is now in the world, it might be more dangerous not to do anything.
Yes. Helena had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering if you've had people say that even these water projects, as you built them, that it will not stop wars and it will not make people, will not make different religions and, fighting each other. What do you tell these people?
Yeah, well, the usual thing is people hear, I hear from people say, the reason we cannot have development is because we have a corrupt government. So what we do first, we take away the corrupt government.
That's a part of the problem too.
Yeah, and then they say after that we will think about the economy.
Yeah.
So I mean, people like to talk about revolutions. It's like in the North Africa and Southwest Asia, so-called Arab Spring. I mean, when these things started in Egypt, I mean, I'm no friend of Mubarak or Gaddafi, and these people, they worked with the British and the United States, and they implemented the policy which was given to them by the World Bank and IMF to destroy their own economies. And they were part of the so-called war on terrorism. And they were allies with Britain and the United States many years. But the idea of revolution, this was not a revolution. Revolution needs ideas. Before you start a revolution, you have to have a complete idea what you want to do with that nation. What happened in Tunisia and Egypt, for example, which was the best example of these, is this was an uprising. People were angry. Their future was stolen from them. Young people work hard to get a good education, but then they have no work, they have no future. They either have to take a boat over the Mediterranean, maybe they make it or not. That's their only chance. Or work as slave labor in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. That's where the view of the world. So these people got fed up. And these people knew that the policy their government was implementing was supported by the EU and the United States. So those people were angry. And it was the right thing, in a sense, to do. People have to protest against injustice. But what happened is that this became militarized. Because the British, the United States, other European countries, they saw a great potential that this could spread to Europe, because Europe is Greece, Spain, Portugal was in the same situation, and that their policies to control the so-called Euro crisis would not work. And therefore they moved to another phase of this thing by militarizing this conflict and say, okay, now we support those people to overthrow these corrupt dictators who were our friends yesterday. And then we started this series of so-called regime change policies, and now we have wars and terrorism spreading all over the place. So the idea of revolution, that's not really a revolution. The American Revolution was a revolution because it had already principles and ideas for how to establish what they call a more perfect society. And what is the purpose of that society? It's not just get rid of the British. They wanted to establish something better, and they had a very clear idea of their mission. But people who revolted in these countries, they had no idea, and then other people came as opportunists and said, now we take the advantage, these Islamic movements, Muslim Brotherhood. They say, now that the West wants to help, why not? We worked with them. We worked in Afghanistan, we worked with them now. But that's the real problem. The peace process with the Palestinians and the Israelis, LaRouche said, if you don't start with economic development, forget about peace. You cannot make political agreements if the people are hungry and thirsty and have no work and so on. And that's why religious fundamentalism takes root in these places right now, because they use the desperation and anger of the people and the young people, and then people come with bags of money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar and say, well, we can solve your problem. You've become a soldier working for us. And you've got sanctions, you get approval from the United States and Europe right now. So Go ahead.